Today's lesson is all about 70-18 and 60-10 and how to weld those completely wrong. You're probably thinking to yourself, you want to be taught how to stick weld the right way, not the wrong way. But failure is the way to learn, and that's what I'm going to show you today is all the ways that you can fail with the 70-18 and 60-10. If you're looking for a little bit more introductory and even some more variables to consider, you can check out this classic video, Weld.com, where Bob goes into the basics of stick welding 101. We're not going to get that in depth on some of the rod classifications. We are going to be using these two rods, these 1/8 70-18 Excaliburs and these 5P Pluses 60-10s from Lincoln Electric, as well as this Spurner 180 SI. Freaking love this little machine, I really do. It's got a lot of beans, it's got the 70-18 and 60-10 settings, so it's able to be that little inverter that could. We're gonna kick this on, we're gonna make sure that we're running DC positive, so our stinger's gonna be plugged into our positive terminal, and our ground's gonna be plugged into our negative the whole time. We're gonna be adjusting a lot of different variables in this case. First, we're gonna take a look at two good examples, and we gotta get suited up. So I'm gonna go ahead and put on my welding hood from Outlaw Leather, my Weld Bros jacket, and my Cayman welding gloves. Make sure I got my safeties on. We're ready to roll. Now, the biggest takeaway that I want you to get out of this video is being able to interpret your welds better. Whether the amperage is too hot, too cold, your travel speed's too slow, too fast, your arc length is messed up, that's what we're really going to dive into today, what those beads look like when you mess them up. You probably got a pretty good idea what a good weld looks like, being that you might be on social media or YouTube. Everyone is posting their good stuff. And I did my best to lay down some good stuff, at least in one rod. We got our 70-18 electrode right here, and we've got our 60-10 electrode right here. They're very different, so I want to cover both of them today. Now again, if you've been welding for a long time, you've probably already got this stuff figured out. This is based on some really intro level stuff. If you guys want to see some more advanced level stuff, I'm just waiting for someone to ask. Besides that point, let's dive into it first with amperage being our first variable to cover. The first thing we're going to do is do a 70-18 weld. We're going to run it too hot first. Now on this machine, you definitely want to go to the 70-18 function. I actually had my had it on 60-10 when I did our 70-18 good weld. It definitely gave that extra burst with a hot start kind of built into it. But we're going to turn our amps up because our one that we did on the plate was 125. We're going to turn it up to 145. That's definitely going to see some results as far as too hot on the plate. And then we'll do one too hot with the 1/8 60-10 electrode. Both of these electrodes being 1/8 inch in diameter, but they still run completely different. Another reason why I wanted to cover it. This was ran at 125 amps. And this one was run closer to 95 in between 100. I think I ran that at 97. Same diameter rod, way different amps. All right, it did crank it up to 150 amps. Now these 70-18s, dude, the 1/8s, you can operate them in between the iceberg and freaking hell, man. I mean, they go from like 95, 100 amps, which I don't recommend. That's just way too cold, to like 145 on some of these. The electrode box usually will say the amperage range that you should operate them in. Whatever machine, inverter, engine drive, whatever it may be, you're gonna have to fine tune it, and it really helps to understand what you're looking at. Again, point of this video. So 150 amps, 70-18, this is gonna be too hot. We'll make sure we try to get a good arc shot of this right here. So one thing you're gonna notice, it's not like too crazy, but there's a lot more of a violent arc. Our puddle's really wide compared to the good one. You can see that even that it's starting to sink in a little bit more, but it's still manageable, especially in the flat position. 70-18s are all position rods, and 150 amps might be the way to go for a flat. Really add some metal deposition, really lay it in there fast and in a hurry. 150 might be right what you need. But you're going to need the material thickness to handle that 150 amps, and you're going to need to make sure that it's pretty much going to handle the flat position. You put this sucker in vertical at 150 amps, and you're going to be in for a really bad time. A little bit more spatter, a lot more aggressive arc, wider bead, a lot flatter of a weld, wider of a weld. That's what you're going to see when it comes to being too hot. If you know me at all, I prefer welding hot. We still even have our slag steel peeling off. I mean, it's a nice, smooth bead. That might be even a nicer bead for the flat profile compared to the good bead that we did. It's really wide. It's going to lay in a lot of metal. It's definitely tying in. That's one thing I like about running as high in the amps as I can handle, because nothing can live in hell, and you're usually depositing metal faster. And it's not anymore, it's just faster. So let's switch over to a 60-10 electrode. Now remember, the example that we did was close to 100 amps, 97. So we're going to go a little bit hotter, but we'll turn it down to 130, turn it to our 60-10 setting. Oh, look at that. Good God. Right off the jump, that is an aggressive start. You can see the puddle, maybe you can see the puddle. It's really elongated, and I can see that puddle is just digging. It's really deep. Now again, in the flat position, there's a lot of forgiveness. You put either one of these electrodes that are all position rods at this amperage in a different position, like vertical or overhead or even horizontal, you're going to see some huge issues where gravity is pulling this bead because the puddle is so fluid. But in the flat position, again, this rod is performing really well, even at a higher amperage. Same thing, wider bead, flatter bead, maybe a little bit more spatter. And in the flat position, things just seem to work out for you at a hotter amperage. It's when we got to go vertical, even horizontal, those things want to start sagging. We're going to have to start turning our amperage down so that that puddle can stick a little bit better. But there's going to be a point where things are going to be too cold, and we'll get into that. Again, you know you've done right when that slag is easy to remove. And again, with it being hot, dude, this thing doesn't look that bad. This is well on the top end of its amperage range recommended before we want to get a bigger rod. But honestly, I like these beads a lot. The way they look, a little bit flatter, a little bit wider, depending on what we're trying to be aiming for, and the position is the amperage that we're gonna run. Again, I like a hotter bead. If you can handle it, go as hot as you can. But when it comes to being too cold, that's where you get risky. Now let's run the innocent scenario that, say you thought you were running some 332 electrodes and we're down at 90 amps. Now remember, the different diameter of electrode, even though it's the same rod, is gonna have a different range. These 332s run really good at like 90 amps, but 120 might be really hot. We'll say the 90 amps is for a good 332 rod, but we're running a 1/8, so that ought to be a little bit too cold. Let's see what that looks like. Now, you might still be able to get away to make a weld, but it's just gonna fight you along the way. We're not trying to go drastic with the too hot, too cold. We wanna see just what it looks like. Too cold is gonna make it harder to strike the rod. Not enough amperage to get to the end of the electrode to get things warmed up. But hopefully once you got a puddle going, you can keep going. Now this puddle is sluggish, slow, tall. The puddle doesn't look like it wants to lay down a whole lot. I'm really having to maintain that arc length to keep this rod, breathing, alive. It's just really sluggish. I see a lot of what I would call cold lap in the bead, where the bead doesn't want to lay into the toes or the front edge of it. I'm not sure how long this is taking me, but this already feels a lot longer. Now we're still going to be able to deposit the same amount of metal, just a lot slower when it's cold. I don't really have a whole lot of recommendations to running a colder amperage unless you just have to. The material just can't handle the heat. This 90 amps is enough to keep this 1/8 alive, but the bead's going to look a little bit different, I can guarantee that. Got all the way to the end, same amount of metal, same amount of rod, still got a peeler. Slow, very slow. Let's take a look. It's interesting, we still got the slag peel. I thought the slag was going to be much tougher to remove. I mean, hell, that came off in one piece. That's kind of nice. And the bead doesn't look bad. We were able to hold a lot of our variables in place to what they should be, like our travel speed and our arc length, to help compensate for that really cold amperage. But just taking a closer look, the bead is taller. Right? The bead's a little bit taller. I don't like the way the toes aren't wetting out as much. It's not laying as flat. Probably something you could get away with, but the bead's just gonna be a lot taller. Let's go like really cold. Let's go like super cold. 55 amps. Maybe you don't have a digital readout. You can't really tell what your machine's doing. Well, you just got it like, I don't know, on setting 1 or something. Get a rod out of this here dealio. We're at 55 amps. No way this is gonna work well. Ooh, looks like a little sparkler, just fizzling away. Still keeping it alive, gotta definitely long arc it a lot. If we get too close, I'm surprised it's not sticking. There it goes. Yeah, get too close, that's definitely gonna stick. Ooh. I wasn't gonna go super far with that one, we definitely stuck the rod. We can see just how cold that looks. Definitely you're seeing that, whatever your machine you're running, you either got too big of a rod, you need to go down in rod size so that little rod can handle what little amperage you got, or you gotta turn up your amps, because that's super cold and that's definitely not gonna work. The other one might work if you're doing something in position, you gotta go vertical, you're fighting something, it's thinner than you'd like, you could still get away with it. but running too far out of those amperage ranges will definitely set you in a bind. So let's run this 6010 uber cold. So the 7018 couldn't handle 55 amps at all. 1/8 electrode 6010. Let's see how well it handles 55 amps. I reckon it'll do okay. Still harder to light up. Definitely feels like a little sparkler. One thing you can do to help along with some cold puddle is like lifting the arc up. Your arc length can help make things a little hotter if you need some more. That's a good tip if you're working in position on things. We'll get into arc length next. While it is laying a bead down, just so cold. Still staying alive. This little sprinter's a trooper. Alright. Guess I lost where I was going there. The slide still comes off good, man. You get a good electrode though. A lot of these issues that if you get a bad electrode, it doesn't matter what amps you run at. Sometimes they just weld bad. I don't believe that's tied into much anything at all, especially in a couple places. Like way back here, there's a big miss where it kind of sputtered on me, but you'll expect that when you get things that are too cold. The point of the amperage thing is you can run hotter, you can run colder, depends on the material thickness and it depends on the position that you're in. You're still gonna lay down the same amount of metal, you got the same rod regardless. It's just, what are you working on? What's your preference? Can you handle some more heat? I always would recommend running as hot as you can, but let me know what you guys think. If you're unfamiliar with arc length, that's okay. It's the distance from the stick rod to the metal. Now both of these rods, like I said, are very different and they kind of prefer a different arc length. 7018, I would say, would like to be as close as you can to the material that you can keep as that rod is burning away. Whereas the 6010, you have to do a little bit more manipulation and it kind of likes a longer arc. And I think it makes two pennies if we just start with a proper arc length right here. So like I said, I'm going really close to the material. I'm a little shaky. And the 7018 honestly likes really close. That's my motto with the 7018, is slow and close. If we start lifting that arc up, you can say things get really droppy. You start dropping bombs, spitting fire. You can't see. It usually happens, and your puddle's not even there. It usually happens because that rod's burning away and you're not paying attention to just keeping up with that burn of the rod. If you're maintaining the proper travel angle and all that good jazz, you should just have to drop your hands. You can go check out our video on how to weld a straight line with the 7018 we just dropped, and that'll really help with that whole process. It's when you get far away with this rod, we're way up there. I mean, obviously you can see the trouble until we completely disconnect from the plate, and now we don't have an arc. Lots of issues when it comes to long arcing a 7018. Just keep those close. So let's go ahead and just run this 6010. Turn it down to about 107, 10 amps up from where we ran our really good one. And we're going to start with a little bit tighter of an arc length. All right, so now that we're rolling, the rule of thumb for arc length is usually about the rod diameter is how far you should try to maintain. Now with the 6010, I'm putting a little bit of manipulation as far as a hot whip technique, kind of staying in my puddle but pushing in a little bit forward ahead. And you can actually get closer and that sucker will be just fine. And that's only operating at those higher amperages. And you can get away with even pulling away further and making a much wider puddle and it not get any issues. Even still, you're going to have a lot more of a sporadic arc. Maintaining that rule of thumb of like 1/8 of an inch or whatever rod diameter you're running usually will keep you right in the zone no matter what. It's a 16th inch diameter rod, 16th of an inch arc length, 332, 332, 1/8, 1/8. I mean, those are all the 32nd apart, and you and I can't tell that difference. So you can get away with a lot, but too far is usually where you're going to actually see the machine jump up in voltage, and you're going to see a lot more spatter, the inconsistent arc. You might pick a little bit more defects. In my opinion, the biggest takeaway here, comparatively speaking to say amperage, is the amperage will change depending on what you're doing. Whereas the arc length and stuff, it really shouldn't change a whole lot. You should really try to make sure you're focusing in on it. You see you got a little bit of a skinnier bead, and as we get wider, we get a little bit more undercut into the weld right back here on the 6010 version. Things get wider, more of a spray kind of situation. The 7018, similar effects. We've got a much wider bead. There's a couple really small pinholes. But typically if you're seeing porosity with a 7018 and you're long arcing it, that's what's happening right there. Being in the flat position is probably the most forgiving. If you put yourself in a 3G or overhead position, or you're working on pipe and your arc length is changing, your bead profile is going to be changing, so your weld size is going to be changing, and then you're going to have probably a couple discontinuities like undercut or porosity depending on what you're working with. Next, we'll move into travel speed for both of these rods. But now we're going to run these 6010s while it's set up. We're going to go ahead and go too fast and too slow of a travel speed with this rod. We're gonna haul dookie. We're not gonna stay in our puddle. We're just gonna like just go super fast. You're gonna see your puddle. It's gonna have a really elongated, really long, skinny, ropey appearance to it as far as your puddle goes. And that's pretty much what your bead is gonna end up looking like. Some processes and some materials are finicky and I kind of want you to weld fast. Little beads and multi-pass welds are preferred. It depends on what kind of crazy alloy you're working on, but we didn't even deposit a lot of metal, so moving fast usually isn't the solution. You can get incomplete fusion, you can trap a lot of things because it's almost like running a little bit too cold because you're not keeping the heat into the puddle. Before we reveal everything, let's go too slow with this sucker. So now we're just gonna stay in that puddle. I'm not gonna do a whole lot of whipping. I'm gonna do like a little circle. In the flat position, it's always forgiving. Just keep that in mind. If we were going uphill, doing this would be very difficult. Just trying to carry this metal in general is just tough, except for in the flat position. Forced to have a long arc because we have so much puddle and so much force right in the center. I have a hard time just staying slow because I want out of there. That's too much puddle. It's just so much heat input into the material. Your rod's like getting cooked. I even see a big old pinhole at the back of that weld. Now we can take a closer look at these travel speeds. All right, let's give it a jimmy. All right, so we can obviously see this is the biggest weld on here. If you're getting too wide, it's gonna be either an amperage issue, way too far away on your arc length, or your travel speed is gonna be too low if your bead is wide, right? The first place I would start is your travel speed. And if you know you're running the right travel speed, make sure you're running a consistent arc length. And make sure you're running the right amperage. You can even see here at the end, we've got this crater is just deep, and it even has a little bit of a pinhole in it. And then the skinny ropey bead, we'll see some undercut in there, and I mean it's just really just not a lot of metal in general, but it's not like that bad. I kind of covered a lot of it with this big fat weld next to it. I'm running out of plate. You really just got to focus on maintaining a travel speed. Travel speed is one of those things, kind of like the arc length, that has to be maintained. Your amperage may vary and your arc length wants to stay consistent, and so should your travel speed if you want the same size weld. Those two things, arc length and travel speed, are so important. That's why my motto for a 7018 is slow and close. Speaking of, let's run this 7018 as far as the travel speed goes. Oh, I hate a fast 7018. All right, switch back to the 7018 mode. We're at 100 and golly, my cap's all sweaty now, coming off my head. Make sure that's at 130 to keep our amperage to constant. All right, this is gonna be too fast with that 7018 rod. Just hauling butts, not staying in our puddle. You know, you're gonna get a skinny, ropey weld, a lot like the 6010, but just no time to tie in, no time to fuse to stuff. Still might make a weld, I just don't recommend it. And if you're seeing yourself with a skinny weld, like a really thin, ropey weld, man, just slow things down. You're in a hurry. You really shouldn't be pulling your hands across the plate or across horizontal, or you shouldn't be pulling anything. You should let the rod do the work. Your hands should just be dropping as far as an appropriate travel speed, at least in flat and in horizontal. Vertical, you're probably going to notice you're going to be slowing down, being that you're fighting gravity. And overhead, quite honestly, is the same as flat or horizontal. It's just difficult because it's over your head. Before we chip that slag, let's go ahead and run a fat daddy. So big old fat 7018 weave or something, if you want to call it that. I'm not going to do any oscillation. I'm just going to keep it in one spot. This is too slow. We got a question about weaving a 7018 weld in D11 code. It's usually just permissible if the company man allows it. I mean, it's not necessarily always an issue. The biggest problem with weaving and travel speed being too slow and staying in one spot on material is you typically just have a really high heat input. And while you might be able to lay down enough metal, is it worth the stress that you're putting on the metal with a weave? Stringers, you're moving a little bit faster, putting less heat in a spot at one time, and kind of just spreading out that stress. Whereas with one big bead, you're putting it all into one big bead. Now people argue that tooth and nail, what's better, weaves or stringers? And I'm gonna just go ahead and tell you, I'm team stringers all day. Some cases, like when I TIG weld, ooh, I'll hog a bead in there. But when it comes to what I think is less stress on a material, stringers every time. Now travel speed is crucial and should always be remained a constant all the way across whatever you're doing. You want to pick a travel speed and stick to it. Now whether you want to carry a little bit more metal than others probably depends on the weld position that you're in. Obviously in the flat we can get away with murder, as you can see, but in a horizontal, especially on a cap on a V-groove, you might see a lot of sag if you try to carry too much metal. Not enough metal, you're not going to fill in what you need to, and likely you're going to get underfill, undercut, uneven edges. You're probably going to miss something. So you still want to stay within your puddle in order to make a successful weld. So all of these things can kind of go hand in hand. You kind of have to let them all marry together. When it comes to your work and travel angle, if you guys want, let me know. We'll dive into the work and travel angle. For me, if your work angle is kind of left or right or up or down, you're fighting gravity the wrong way. You might have a lopsided bead or a sagging bead, or it's not picking a side that you want because your work angle is not in the right direction. If your travel angle is not right, whether you're pushing or pulling, you can pretty much get away with like a 10 degrees push or pull with any rod, any process. I don't care. I'll die on that hill. But if you guys want to see some more stuff that have to go with variables as far as stick welding or TIG MIG, whatever it may be, you want to see it in a 2F, 3, 4, you want to see some V-grooves in all positions, you want to see some pipes, some alloys, let me know. All I'm doing to make these videos is looking in the comment section, seeing what's interesting, or just looking things up myself of what people might be interested in. But if you think something's interesting, let me know. I'm just trying to weld something. We'll see you guys on the next weld. I hope this one helped. Let's go with too fast. We're gonna hold dookie.